The crack of a rifle shot cut through the chilly Wyoming dawn as Grace Owens ducked behind the weathered barn door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her brothers were drunk again, celebrating their latest scheme, selling her to Bartholomew Jenkins, a man 3 times her age, with a reputation that made even hardened outlaws keep their distance. It was 1878, and in the unforgiving landscape of the frontier, an orphaned young woman of 20 was considered little more than property by men like her brothers. "Grace, you get your ungrateful hideout here." Thomas, the eldest of her 3 brothers, bellowed from the yard. "Jenkins paid good money for you, and he'll be here by sundown." Grace pressed her back against the rough-hewn timber, clutching the small bundle containing her mother's locket and the few belongings she could grab. Her brothers had been her only family since their parents died of fever 4 years ago, but they'd grown meaner with each passing season, drowning in whiskey and gambling debts. Now they'd found a way to solve their financial troubles by selling their own sister. "Please, Lord," she whispered, "show me a way out." The answer to her prayer came in the form of heavy footfalls on the barn's dirt floor. Grace whirled around, ready to flee, when she found herself staring into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. A tall man with sun-bronzed skin and sandy hair stood before her, his expression a mixture of concern and wariness. "Miss," he said in a low voice, "I don't mean to startle you, but those men out there don't sound particularly friendly." "They're my brothers," Grace replied, her voice barely audible. "And they've sold me to Bartholomew Jenkins." The stranger's jaw tightened. "Jenkins? The cattle baron from Sweetwater?" He shook his head. "No decent man would buy a woman." "Well, he's coming to collect me by sundown." Grace straightened her spine, summoning what little courage remained. "I'm not waiting around for that." The man nodded, decision forming in his eyes. "My name's Wyatt Walker. I've got a fast horse, and I'm headed north across the county line to Montana Territory. If you're looking for a way out, I can help you." Grace studied him carefully. He wasn't dressed like an outlaw. His clothes were worn but clean, his shaven face suggesting some level of respectability. A deputy's badge glinted on his vest. "You're a lawman?" she asked. "Was," he corrected. "Headed to a new posting in Helena. I stopped here to water my horse when I heard the commotion." He glanced toward the barn door. "Whatever you decide, you'd best do it quickly. Those men are getting more agitated by the minute." Outside, the sound of breaking glass and angry curses confirmed his assessment. Grace made her decision in an instant. "I'll go with you, Mr. Walker." He nodded once. "Stay close." Wyatt led her to the back of the barn where a magnificent chestnut stallion waited. He helped her mount before swinging up behind her. "Hold tight," he instructed, and then they were moving, bursting through the rear barn door and thundering across the open plain. "She's running," came a furious shout behind them. Another rifle shot cracked the air, but they were already stretching into a gallop, the horse's powerful strides eating up the distance between Grace and the life she was desperately fleeing. Grace clung to the saddle horn as the wind whipped her auburn hair free from its pins. The warmth of Wyatt's chest against her back was both reassuring and unsettling. She'd never been this close to a man before, certainly not one who was essentially a stranger. Yet something in his steady presence made her feel safer than she had in years. They rode hard for hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horse at a small creek. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Wyatt finally slowed their pace. "We should be safe for now," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "We've crossed into Johnson County. Your brothers won't follow us this far. They'd risk running into the sheriff here, who doesn't take kindly to troublemakers from over the line." Grace nodded, too exhausted to speak. When Wyatt suggested they stop for the night at a small trading post visible in the distance, she could only murmur her agreement. The trading post was little more than a cabin with supplies and a stable, run by an elderly couple named the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson took one look at Grace's disheveled appearance and ushered her inside while Mr. Henderson helped Wyatt with the horse. "You poor dear," the older woman clucked, setting a bowl of stew before Grace. "Running from something terrible, I'd wager." Grace hesitated, but the kindness in the woman's eyes loosened her tongue. She explained about her brothers and Jenkins, careful to emphasize that Wyatt was simply helping her escape, nothing more. Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. "That Jenkins has a reputation that would curdle fresh milk. Your deputy friend did right by you." She patted Grace's hand. "You can stay in the back room tonight. It's small, but it's clean." Later, as Grace settled onto the narrow cot, she heard Wyatt's low voice speaking with Mr. Henderson outside. Their conversation drifted through the thin walls. "My brothers might come looking," she heard Wyatt say. "They'll be armed and dangerous. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "Wouldn't be the first time we've dealt with unsavory types," Mr. Henderson replied. "The missus and I keep a shotgun handy. But you're right to be cautious. Best you two head out at first light." Grace closed her eyes, guilt washing over her. This kind stranger had risked his life to help her, and now he was delaying his journey to Montana because of her. She resolved to find a way to continue alone as soon as possible, to free him from the obligation he'd taken on. Morning came with a gentle knock on her door. Mrs. Henderson entered with a bundle of clothing. "These belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Denver," she explained. "They should fit you well enough, and they're more practical for traveling than that dress." Grace accepted the gift with tearful thanks, changing into the sturdy skirt, blouse, and jacket. When she emerged from the room, she found Wyatt at the table, sharing coffee with Mr. Henderson. Wyatt looked up as she entered, and something in his expression shifted. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, his eyes taking in her transformed appearance. "You look ready for the trail," he finally said, clearing his throat. Grace thanked the Hendersons for their hospitality, insisting on leaving what little money she had as payment, though they protested. "Just promise you'll send word when you're settled somewhere safe," Mrs. Henderson said, pressing a small package of food into Grace's hands. Outside, as Wyatt prepared the horse, Grace gathered her courage. "Mr. Walker," she began, "I'm grateful beyond words for your help, but I can't ask you to continue delaying your journey to Montana. Perhaps there's a stage I could take from here?" Wyatt turned to face her, his expression serious. "Miss Owens, the nearest stage stop is 2 days' ride, and your brothers could easily intercept you there. The safest course is for us to continue north together, at least until we reach a larger settlement where you might find work and protection. But your position in Helena will wait," he finished firmly. "I've sent a telegram explaining the delay. They understand that a lawman's duty is to help those in need, even former lawmen." Something in his tone suggested there was more to his departure from his previous post than a simple transfer, but Grace knew better than to pry. "Thank you," she said simply. They rode out as the sun breached the eastern hills, Grace once again seated before Wyatt on his sturdy mount. The day passed in relative quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the landscape gradually changed from flat plains to rolling hills dotted with pine. By mid-afternoon, they reached a shallow river crossing. Wyatt dismounted to check the depth, declaring it safe to ford. As Grace waited on the bank, the distant sound of hoofbeats made her blood run cold. "Riders coming," she warned, pointing to the dust cloud visible behind them. Wyatt's expression hardened as he quickly helped her back onto the horse and mounted behind her. "Could be anyone," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "But let's not wait to find out." They urged the horse into the river, water splashing up to their knees as they crossed. On the far bank, Wyatt didn't slow but pushed the stallion into a gallop, heading for a stand of trees that offered some cover. The riders behind them were gaining. As they reached the treeline, Wyatt abruptly turned the horse off the trail, guiding it through the dense pines. "There's an old trapper's cabin not far from here," he said. "We might be able to hide there until they pass." The cabin was little more than a one-room shack, Its roof partially collapsed, but it offered concealment. They dismounted quickly, and Wyatt led the horse around to the back, tying it where it wouldn't be easily spotted. "Stay inside," he instructed Grace, drawing his revolver. "I'll keep watch." Grace huddled in the dimness of the cabin, listening to the approaching riders. She could hear her brother Thomas's voice now, cursing loudly. "That deputy's got to be around here somewhere. Check those trees." Grace held her breath as footsteps crunched outside the cabin. Through a crack in a wall, she could see Wyatt crouched at the corner of the building, his gun ready. "Thomas, we've been riding all day," came another voice, her brother James. "She ain't worth all this trouble. Jenkins paid $500 for her." Thomas shouted. "You want to go back and tell him we lost his property?" Grace winced at being referred to as property, anger burning through her fear. "Maybe they went north toward the pass," suggested a third voice, her youngest brother, Peter. There was a tense silence, then the sound of retreating footsteps. After what seemed like an eternity, Wyatt appeared at the cabin door. "They've moved on, but they'll be back," he said grimly. "We need to change our route. They'll be watching the main trails to Montana now." "I'm sorry," Grace whispered, the full weight of their situation settling on her shoulders. "I've brought nothing but trouble to you." Wyatt's expression softened. "You've brought nothing of the sort, Miss Owens. No one deserves to be sold like cattle, especially not to a man like Jenkins." His conviction gave her strength. "Where will we go now?" "West," he decided. "Through the mountains. It's a harder journey, but less likely to be watched. I know some folks in a mining settlement who can be trusted." As dusk fell, they set out again, moving carefully through the forest. The mountain air grew colder as they climbed, and Grace found herself leaning back against Wyatt's chest for warmth. "Tell me about Montana," she said softly, trying to distract herself from the discomfort of the journey and the persistent fear of capture. Wyatt's voice rumbled pleasantly against her back as he described the vast skies and rugged beauty of the territory where he hoped to make a new start. "My father was a lawman there," he explained. "He taught me to respect the badge and what it stands for. When he died, I followed in his footsteps." "But you said you was a lawman," Grace prompted gently. There was a long pause before he answered. "I crossed a man I shouldn't have. The county commissioner's son got drunk and shot a young woman who refused his advances. I arrested him, but his father had me removed from my position. Said I'd fabricated evidence." "That's horrible," Grace said, indignation flaring on his behalf. "Justice works differently for the powerful," Wyatt replied, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "But Helena's offered me a second chance, away from that influence." They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, Wyatt insisting Grace take his bedroll while he kept watch. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she pondered the strange twist of fate that had brought this honorable man into her life at the exact moment she needed him most. By morning, a light snow was falling, unusual for early autumn but not unheard of in the mountains. They pressed on, following game trails that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. By midday, the snow had stopped, but dark clouds threatened more to come. "There's a settlement just beyond that ridge," Wyatt said, pointing ahead. "Silver Creek. Small place, but the people are good folk." Grace nodded, relief flooding through her at the prospect of warm shelter and fresh supplies. As they crested the ridge, however, the sight below made them both draw up short. Smoke rose from what should have been a bustling mining town. Instead, several buildings were ablaze, and even from this distance, they could hear shouts and the occasional gunshot. "Raid," Wyatt said grimly. "Likely outlaws hitting the mine payroll." "We can't go down there," Grace gasped. "No," he agreed. "But we can't stay exposed up here either. There's a line shack about 2 miles west that the mining company uses for storage. We'll shelter there until it's safe to move on." The line shack was sturdy but sparse, containing some basic supplies and a small stove. Wyatt got a fire going while Grace took stock of what food was available: some beans, jerky, and coffee, enough to sustain them for a few days if necessary. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. Even with the stove burning, the shack was drafty, and Grace found herself shivering beneath the thin blanket she'd found on a shelf. Wyatt, noticing her discomfort, hesitated before speaking. "Miss Owens, I don't mean to be forward, but in these conditions, sharing warmth is sometimes necessary for survival." Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but the practical part of her mind acknowledged the truth of his words. She nodded her agreement, and Wyatt carefully arranged their blankets together near the stove. They lay side by side, a respectful distance between them but close enough to benefit from shared warmth. "Thank you," Grace said softly in the darkness. "Not just for this, but for everything. Most men wouldn't have risked so much for a stranger." "I think we've moved beyond being strangers, Miss Owens," Wyatt replied, his voice equally soft. "Grace," she corrected. "Please call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart beat faster. Morning brought heavy snow and the realization that they might be stranded for longer than anticipated. Wyatt ventured out to check on the horse and gather more firewood, returning with frost clinging to his beard and the news that the pass ahead would be impassable until the storm cleared. They settled into an unexpected domestic routine over the next 2 days, sharing the small space with increasing comfort in each other's presence. Grace discovered that Wyatt was a surprisingly good cook, turning their meager supplies into satisfying meals. In turn, she repaired his torn shirt, using a small sewing kit she found in the cabin supplies. On the third evening, as they sat by the stove sharing stories of their childhoods, Grace realized with a start that she felt more at peace in this rustic shack with Wyatt than she had in years at her brother's farm. There was something about his quiet strength and unwavering integrity that made her feel both protected and respected, a combination she'd rarely experienced with men. "What will you do when we reach Montana?" Wyatt asked, breaking into her thoughts. Grace considered the question. "Find work, I suppose. I can cook and sew. Maybe a boarding house would hire me." Wyatt nodded, looking thoughtful. "Helena's growing fast. Plenty of opportunities for someone willing to work hard." "And you'll take up your new deputy position," Grace said, trying to ignore the pang she felt at the thought of their inevitable parting. "Yes," he confirmed, though something in his expression suggested uncertainty. The next morning, they awoke to find the snow had stopped and the sun was breaking through the clouds. After a quick breakfast, they packed their few belongings and prepared to continue their journey. As they emerged from the cabin, however, they were met with an unwelcome sight. 5 riders were approaching from the direction of Silver Creek, and even at a distance, Grace recognized the stocky build of her brother Thomas leading the group. Inside, Wyatt said urgently, pushing her back toward the cabin door, "Take the rifle from behind the stove and be ready." Grace's hands trembled as she retrieved the weapon. Through the window, she watched Wyatt calmly step forward to meet the approaching men, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "That's far enough," he called when the riders were within earshot. Thomas pulled up his horse, squinting against the sun's glare on the snow. "Well, if it ain't the hero deputy. Where's my sister, lawman?" "She's not your concern anymore," Wyatt replied evenly. "Turn around and ride out. There doesn't need to be trouble." Thomas laughed, an ugly sound that carried on the cold air. "Trouble's already here. Jenkins is mighty upset about losing his purchase, offering a reward now dead or alive." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. From her position, she could see that 2 of the men with her brothers weren't family. They had the hard-eyed look of hired guns. 5 against 1, Thomas continued, confidence lacing his voice. "Not good odds, deputy." "I've faced worse," Wyatt said, his stance relaxed but alert. What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. One of the hired guns made a move for his weapon, but Wyatt was faster, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. The man toppled from his horse as the others scrambled for cover, bullets flying. Grace, heart in her throat, watched as Wyatt dove behind a woodpile, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Another rider fell, but then Wyatt grunted in pain as a bullet grazed his arm. Without thinking, Grace raised the rifle and fired through the window, the shot going wide but causing enough distraction for Wyatt to change position. The remaining men, including her brothers, were now pinned between them in a deadly crossfire. "Give it up, Thomas," Grace shouted. "You've brought enough shame to our family name." There was a moment of tense silence, then Peter, her youngest brother, suddenly threw down his gun. "She's right, Thomas," he said. "This ain't right, what we're doing. Pa would be ashamed." Thomas spat in the snow. "Pa's dead, and his precious moral code didn't leave us with anything but debts. It left us with our humanity," Peter countered, dismounting slowly with his hands raised. "I'm done with this." James, always the follower, looked uncertainly between his brothers before finally lowering his weapon as well. Thomas, seeing himself abandoned, let out a roar of frustration and raised his gun for one last desperate shot at Wyatt. Grace fired first, her bullet striking her eldest brother in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. In the aftermath, with Thomas and the remaining hired gun disarmed and nursing their wounds, Wyatt approached Grace's younger brothers. "Take them back across the county line," he instructed, nodding toward Thomas and his accomplice. "And tell Jenkins that if he ever comes looking for Grace Owens again, he'll answer to the law in Montana Territory." Peter nodded, relief evident in his face. "I'm sorry, Grace," he said, looking to where she stood in the cabin doorway. "I should have stopped this sooner." "Go home, Peter," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions churning within her. "Make something better of yourself." As her brothers rode away, leading the injured men and the riderless horses, Grace finally allowed herself to tremble, the rifle slipping from her grasp. Wyatt was at her side instantly, his strong arms enfolding her as the tears came. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe now." They remained at the line shack one more night to allow Wyatt's arm to rest. The wound was minor, little more than a deep scratch, but the confrontation had drained them both. They sat close by the stove, the reality of what they'd been through creating a new intimacy between them. "I've never shot anyone before," Grace admitted quietly, "let alone my own brother." "You did what you had to do," Wyatt assured her. "And you likely saved my life in the process." She looked up at him, really studied his face, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship, the steadiness in his gaze that had been her anchor through this ordeal. "What happens now?" she asked. Wyatt took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "That depends on you, Grace. I still aim to take that position in Helena, but, she prompted when he hesitated. "But I find myself reluctant to part ways with you once we arrive," he admitted, a vulnerability in his expression she hadn't seen before. "These past days, despite the danger, have been important to me." Grace felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "They've been important to me too, Wyatt." He smiled then, transforming his serious face into something so handsome it made her breath catch. "Perhaps," he suggested carefully, "you might consider staying in Helena as well. Not as someone under my protection, but as a companion, if that would be agreeable to you." Grace recognized the offer for what it was, not yet a declaration of love, but an opportunity for something to grow between them, something that had already taken root during their journey. "That would be very agreeable," she replied, squeezing his hand. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect for traveling. They set out early, Wyatt's arm around Grace's waist as they rode, no longer simply for practicality, but because both wanted the closeness. The journey to Helena took another week, their pace slowed by mountain passes still heavy with snow, but Grace found herself savoring each day. They talked of everything and nothing: Wyatt's childhood dreams of exploring the western frontier, Grace's love of books, and secret hope to one day open a small school. At night, they slept close for warmth, and if sometimes Wyatt's hand found hers in the darkness, or Grace's head rested against his shoulder, neither mentioned it by daylight. There was time for those acknowledgments later, when the shadow of pursuit no longer loomed over them. When they finally crested the last hill and saw Helena spread before them in the valley, Grace felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The end of their journey meant safety, but it also meant stepping into an unknown future. Wyatt seemed to sense her thoughts. "It's a good town," he assured her. "Growing fast, but with a strong sense of community. The kind of place where a person can start fresh." Grace nodded, finding comfort in his confidence. "Then let's go meet our future, Deputy Walker." He smiled at the formal address, then leaned in unexpectedly, his lips brushing hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. When he pulled back, his eyes were serious but warm. "Whatever happens in Helena, Grace Owens, I want you to know that meeting you was the best twist of fate I could have imagined." Grace, heartful, could only nod in agreement as they rode together toward the town that would become their home. 1 year later, Grace stood at the window of their small house on the outskirts of Helena, watching as Wyatt chopped wood in the yard. The town had welcomed them both, Wyatt quickly earning respect as a fair and capable deputy, Grace finding purpose as an assistant at the local school. Their courtship had been proper but swift, both of them certain of what they wanted. They were married that spring in a simple ceremony attended by their new friends and, surprisingly, Grace's brother Peter, who had made good on his promise to change his ways. Now, as the autumn leaves fell around their homestead, Grace placed a hand on her slightly rounded belly, smiling at the future growing within her. She had fled across a county line to escape being sold, only to find something she never expected: a love as vast as the Montana sky and as enduring as the mountains that had sheltered them. When Wyatt looked up and caught her watching, his smile was all the confirmation she needed that some journeys, no matter how harrowing their beginning, led exactly where they were meant to.